slams into a residential neighborhood less than 2 miles from the runway. There are no survivors. Investigators search the wreckage, but find few clues.
The aircraft was slowing down almost nothing on the hill.
But a close examination of radar data provides a lead.
They're cleared to descend, and then they wait a full 2 minutes.
Wow. We really wondered what is the situation in the cockpit at that time.
Hey, you guys know where you're going?
Just going to get some weather. I'd love to have you updated with the flight.
Well, did you hear that?
ExecuFlight 1526 is climbing towards cruising altitude over the US Midwest.
Let's keep climbing with 1,500 feet per minute.
Roger.
On board are 7 executives from a Florida-based property management company.
Sorry.
They chartered the luxury jet from ExecuFlight, a private carrier based in Fort Lauderdale. Johnny Shackelford is a former captain who flew with ExecuFlight.
ExecuFlight caters to the people of South Florida for business purposes, also to entrepreneurs, athletes, and even entertainers.
17,000 feet.
Roger. 17,000 feet. Leveling off.
ExecuFlight 1526 is flying a short 35-minute flight northeast from Dayton to Akron, Ohio. First Officer Renato Marchese is the pilot flying the twin-engine Hawker 700. He's logged more than 4,000 hours flying various private jets. Captain Oscar Chavez is originally from Colombia and has logged over 6,000 hours flying private jets and cargo planes.
The captain had flown with me as a first officer. He was a good pilot. Oscar and Renato both seemed to enjoy flying a great deal. It was a passion for both of them.
Hey guys, we've just reached our cruising altitude. You know the drill. We'll be landing in Akron in half an hour. Anyone else want a drink?
The Hawker 700 passenger experience was more than comfortable. It had a good galley. Had plenty of bedroom. The interiors were updated. It was a very nice airplane.
Cheers.
Zipline 1526, descend to 13,000.
Zipline is ExecuFlight's call sign.
Descending to 13,000 feet.
Zipline 1526.
Good check the weather.
Automated weather observation. Wind 290 at 07. Overcast 1,800. Temperature 090 Celsius.
Alright. We have overcast weather.
The crew prepares for possible bad weather in Akron.
Okay, let's see. Akron, right.
Heading?
249.
Flight 1526 continues its descent. Akron Airport is less than 20 minutes away.
I'm gonna go check see where we're at. Hey, you guys know where you're going?
You bet. Look,
It says right here on the chart. I'd love to have you updated all the time, but there's going to be some weather, so we can't be distracted.
It's not like the airlines where you have a closed door. There's an open door and they can walk into the cockpit and ask questions.
As Flight 1526 descends to 9,000 feet,
Akron visibility 1.5 minutes. Sky condition. Overcast 600 broken.
the crew learns the weather in Akron is getting worse.
Temperature 11 Celsius.
They need to know if it's still possible to land there.
1.5 mile visibility.
What visibility does this approach want?
140 miles. Alright, so we have visibility.
6 minutes from Akron, the crew has a new distraction. A flight instructor is teaching a student pilot how to land in bad weather on the same runway assigned to Flight 1526.
Zipline 1526. We do have another aircraft that's inbound to the airport that is slower than you. Fly heading 360, reduce speed 170, descend to maintain 3,000.
The crew is asked to alter their course, delay their descent, and maintain their altitude at 3,000 feet.
Speed is 170 and 360. Zipline 1526.
Zipline 1526. The Piper is on the ground. You are cleared for localized without approach.
Info cars up to 5. Thank you.
Zipline 1526.
The Piper radios Flight 1526 with a weather update.
Hey guys, we just landed on a localizer and broke out right at minimum.
Appreciate it.
We broke out right at minimums, which means you're at the minimum visibility necessary for the approach.
Flight 1526 is now 4 miles from the runway as it starts its final approach.
You check if I've got everything. This one.
Everything is all set. Stand by.
2.5 miles from the airport, the pilots are still searching for the runway. Finally, the plane breaks through the clouds.
Ground. Keep going. Okay, get it out.
I got it.
What's going on?
ExecuFlight 1526 has crashed into a 2-story residential building. Everyone on board is dead. The NTSB must now determine what caused this fatal accident. ExecuFlight 1526 plunged into a residential neighborhood in Akron, Ohio. Incredibly, none of the residents were home during the crash. But the neighborhood is on edge.
You just opened up plane top in a residential area like this. This is crazy.
It looks like the left wing hit first.
When NTSB investigators arrive on scene, they notice a large gouge leading to the crash site.
One of the first things I noticed as I was walking up was a large gouge in the front yard in front of one of the townhomes. It obviously told me that there was a control problem with this airplane on the approach.
Flaps at 45.
Investigators closely examined the wreckage to determine how the plane was configured.
One of the things that we did learn very early on was that flaps were at a 45-degree or full configuration for this landing. We knew they were trying to land.
So, they configured to land, and then they crashed less than 2 miles from the runway. Why? Let's take a look at the engines.
Did the engines fail as the plane approached the airport?
It's in pretty bad shape.
One of the things that we're looking for with the engines at the accident site was if they were operating. We really wanted to see if there was dirt, concrete bits, that type of thing inside the engine.
It's like a building insulation. Soil.
Those gave us indications that at impact these things were producing power.
The NTSB is no further ahead in solving the mystery of Flight 1526. A team is dispatched to air traffic control, hoping a controller can provide some insight.
No mayday call. Nothing unusual. Well, they were delayed by Piper. It was ahead of them. I instructed them to change heading, reduce speed, and maintain 3,000 until cleared, which I did at 14:49.22 when they were 5 miles in. At 15:26, the Piper's on the ground. You are cleared for localized time approach. The Piper didn't affect the landing.
The Piper was on the ground when the business jet was still about 5 miles from the airport. Ample distance for a safe landing. At the crash site, investigators combed through the wreckage for more clues.
What I needed to know was there anything in the accident wreckage that was recoverable from an operational standpoint? The material that the pilots used, the cockpit, things that could be documented, that's what I wanted to see.
Hey, check this out.
We found manuals that the pilots were required to have on board.
This is something. Grab Nevin's back.
It was damaged and it was burnt, but we were able to examine it.
Investigators then make their most significant discovery so far.
We found the angle of attack indicator in the cockpit wreckage. That's important because at a certain angle of attack, the wing will stall.
What angle were you at?
It was damaged extensively, but you could see that the needle was in the red band.
The angle of attack indicates it's in the red. You're stalled. In other words, this wing was no longer flying. It's as simple as that.
Investigators determined that the plane stalled as it approached the airport. Now they must understand why.
It's great. Get that to Washington.
The cockpit voice recorder from ExecuFlight 1526 is recovered and sent to NTSB headquarters for analysis.
When we found out the aircraft did have a cockpit voice recorder, the first thing we were very interested in doing is making sure it got back to our labs. I didn't know if we had good information.
The CVR is doubly important in this case, since the Hawker 700 wasn't equipped with a flight data recorder.
Flight data recorders are incredibly important because they give us a no-question look at precisely what the flight dynamics were all the way to impact.
These investigations are like a jigsaw puzzle, and with the flight data recorder, the pieces of the puzzle are much bigger and easier to put together. By not having a flight data recorder, it didn't give us a whole lot of information early on in the investigation.
While investigators wait for the voice recording, they work with what they have, the documents found in the cockpit wreckage.
The weight and balance. Hey, look at that.
We found that the weight and balance didn't account for the auxiliary power unit. It's a little jet engine in the back that helps power the aircraft when it's on the ground.
So, they had no APU.
The team wonders how this compares to what they discovered at the crash site.
Hello, APU.
You saw that the APU was on board because we found it in the wreckage.
Looks like they were carrying more weight than they thought.
Investigators believe they found an error in the plane's documented weight and balance.
Were they too heavy? Wonder how much this plane truly weighed.
The pilots made their calculations without accounting for an APU, but there clearly was one on board.
We certainly had a concern about whether or not the airplane was within its weight and balance.
The NTSB calculates the actual weight of the plane during its final flight.
The APU weighs 300 pounds.
And according to the aircraft refueler, they were loaded with 8,160 pounds of fuel, but they only wrote down 7,700. So how much in total were they over by? They were only 286 pounds overweight.
The plane's actual weight was slightly more than what the pilots recorded.
It wouldn't really make a performance difference on the aircraft.
The weight of the APU and the additional fuel was not enough to affect the balance of the airplane.
But it did tell us that this crew and this company wasn't following their procedures perfectly. Somebody wasn't watching what they were supposed to be doing.
Investigators need to look elsewhere to explain why Flight 1526 stalled.
We knew that there was not a flight data recorder on this airplane, so that's frustrating because we don't have the precise details about the airspeed, the altitude, and the attitude of the aircraft.
To solve the case, the NTSB begins compiling what data they do have, the radar data from air traffic control.
Show me what you got so far.
The turning point in our investigation came when our engineer was able to recreate our aircraft performance from the radar data.
Okay. They were 150 knots, 4 minutes before the crash. And keep on.
Our aircraft performance expert was able to estimate the airspeed of the airplane, the angle of attack, the attitude, the altitude, and rate of descent.
As the plane approaches the airport, you expect the airspeed to decrease. It drops from 300 down to 150, everything normal.
Investigators find nothing unusual about the flight, until they focus on the last 2 minutes.
Look here, the speed drops to 130 knots, and then it keeps dropping to 98 knots. No wonder they stalled.
The thing that we stood out was the excessive rate of descent at the very end was 98 knots, which is going to stall the airplane.
Airspeed is life. This is one of the most important points in flying any airplane, but especially a jet.
Maybe they're trying to stay clear of the pipe?
Doubt it. The controller told them the runway was clear 3 minutes before it stalled.
The airspeed data leaves investigators with more questions.
Let's look at the altitude data.
The team reviews the plane's descent profile for the period leading up to the crash.
The early part of the descent looks pretty normal. They're doing a dive and drive approach. They level off at 9,000, 5,000, 4,000. Look at that. That's on. Can you blow that up?
They make an important discovery.
Look, they hold at 3,000 feet for an entire 2 minutes. That's way too long. And then they plunge steeply. Bring up the final approach they were supposed to take. It's not even close.
On normal approaches, the glide path allows the airplane to descend on a general 3-degree path all the way down to the runway.
It looks like they started their final approach too late.
And then have to race to catch up.
The data shows that after delaying their approach, the pilots descended very steeply and at twice the normal rate.
Once they started diving the airplane down to 2,000 feet a minute to get to that lower altitude, that approach was unstable. And at that point in time, they should have executed a go-around.
The controller told us he acknowledged his instruction to descend.
Zipline 1526, the Piper is on the ground. You are cleared for localizer 25 approach.
Clear for localizer 25. Thank you. They're cleared to descend, and then they wait. Full 2 minutes. Why?
We really wondered what is the situation in the cockpit at that time.
NTSB investigators turned to the cockpit voice recorder from Flight 1526 to understand why the pilots delayed their final descent into Akron.
Take it from the first instruction about that Piper.
This is 1526. We do have an aircraft inbound at the airport that is slower than you. Fly heading 360. Reduce speed 170. Descend and maintain 3,000.
Down to 3,000, 170 is the speed, and 360. Zipline 1526. Down to 3,000, he was 170 knots. Okay, I'll do back everything.
Somebody lowered the landing gear to start slowing the airplane out and creating drag to hopefully get a little bit more spacing between them and the other airplane.
Did you hear what he said? There's another plane on the approach. He's slower than us. We don't know if he's on the ground.
The captain was very concerned about the spacing between them and the training flight and was saying that to the co-pilot.
Did you hear that?
Investigators hear the sound of the engine thrust decreasing.
Let's see the airspeed again. The airspeed drops from 170 down to 140. That is way slower than he needs to be going. Look, you're 140.
This is 1526. The Piper is on the ground. You are cleared for localizer 25 approach.
Clear for localizer 25.
Flight 1526 is now at 3,000 feet and positioned to fly straight into Akron Airport.
They should start their descent.
Why did the pilots delay their descent for 2 minutes, forcing them to catch up?
You're 120. You can't keep decreasing your speed.
Once the co-pilot received the warning from the captain that they were too slow, the co-pilot should have increased thrust significantly.
But instead, the pilots get into a debate.
Oh, 120. When do you get to 120? It's more like 125, which is the approach. But you still got the flaps to go. They go down. This is what I'm saying. If you continue decreasing your speed, why? Because we're going to stop. I don't want to stop. How do we... Stop. They are so busy arguing about their speed that they forget to start their descent.
There was about 2 minutes of conversation concerning the airplane's speed. The pilot and a first officer were actually arguing that it was getting too slow.
That delay of almost 2 minutes is critical. He's already too slow, and he's overflown the altitude he should be at. And now they've got to chase the approach. Now he's got to get the airplane down fast.
Okay.
What investigators hear next is even more shocking.
Hey guys, we just landed on the localizer and broke out right at their bumps.
They were notified that the small airplane had landed safely on the runway.
Full flaps. Stop. Full flaps at that speed? What was he thinking? Bring up the altitude graph again.
Okay, that's why the plane starts to drop like a rock.
The team finally understands why Flight 1526 ended up in a 2,000 feet per minute descent, twice the recommended rate. The first officer was racing to get the plane back on course.
The airplane is too high, it's too slow, and with full flaps rather than partial flaps. They really need to get down in a hurry. And really that is the turning point when they said this airplane is not configured properly for the approach, and this puts the crew and passengers in really a lot of danger.
You should have just called him this approach. Try it again.
Investigators now need to understand why the pilots continued their dangerous descent.
When we look at the errors that the pilots made, we really had to wonder, what was the background?
NTSB investigator Satya Silva examines the pilots' personnel records to see if they explain their behavior on the day of the accident.
The first officer had more than 4,000 hours of flight time. He was the pilot in command for 3,200 hours, and he passed all his courses.
Yep.
Yeah, just turned 50. No sign of drug or alcohol in the system. But take a look at this. Looks like people no night or 2 nights before the accident. Could he have been fatigued?
For the first officer, what we found was he did not have the rest several days earlier that the regulations require.
Let's see what the airline has to say.
So we wanted to take a look and see if a chronic fatigue problem may have manifested itself several days later to hopefully explain why this crew, and particularly the first officer, was making so many mistakes.
Thanks for coming in.
Happy to help out.
Silva interviews ExecuFlight Captain Bonnie Shackelford, who had flown with First Officer Marchese leading up to the crash.
Tell me about your last flight with the first officer.
2 weeks before the accident, we flew into Fort Lauderdale. Wanted to fly to Mexico overnight. Like now.
That would be fine to go, considering the duty time issue, as long as they remained overnight in Mexico.
So, did he sleep overnight in Mexico?
No, came right back to Fort Lauderdale.
I talked to him the night before the crash. He told me that he was worn out from the other trip. Even though he was legal as far as the number of hours between, he was not rested. He should not have been on that flight.
The fact that the first officer had to fly an overnight flight and not sleep when his body wanted to sleep resulted in circadian disruption.
We know that human beings have limits. If you're not getting the appropriate sleep over time, your attitude can go to heck in a handbasket, and that can crash airplanes.
Because the first officer did have the required amount of sleep the night before the crash, investigators can't definitively point to sleep deprivation as the cause of their poor decision-making. There's something about the flight that still troubles Silver.
How often would the first officer be the pilot flying?
Only if there were no paying passengers.
Why?
Company policy.
The company did have a procedure to enable first officers to get experience flying the aircraft, and those were in empty legs where passengers weren't on board.
Renato should not have been flying. He should have been Oscar.
Silver discovers that the captain violated standard operating procedures.
What we don't know, and what is a little confusing, is why in this case, when you had passengers in the back, you had weather that was going to be a factor and an approach that was going to be relatively challenging, why this captain decided to allow his first officer to fly.
The NTSB wants to know why Captain Chavez broke company policy, allowing his first officer to fly the plane with clients on board.
Take a look at this. The captain didn't get much sleep either. He got a full night's sleep before the crash, but he didn't get a full 8 hours for 4 nights before that. Maybe he was also fatigued.
That's possible.
As we looked further back into his records, it looks like the days prior, he actually only averaged about 6 hours of sleep.
Investigators listen for any indication of fatigue on the cockpit voice recorder.
Let's pick up where we left off, the start of the final descent.
Descending from 3,000 feet, the crew begins their landing checklist.
Can you check if I've got the VP? Ignition, everything's all set. Stand by. Fuel damper, autopilot, main air valves. He just stops in the middle of his landing checklist.
It's like he's distracted.
There were checklists that were supposed to be done all the way through. We found on cockpit voice recorder all the checklists that they should have complied with were never completed.
Instead of finishing the checklist, the captain's focus turns to the plane's erratic descent.
Don't dive. 2,000 feet per minute. Yeah, 2,000 feet per minute. Don't go 2,000 feet per minute. We'll be there.
The co-pilot was being coached so much by this captain that at this point, this is a very serious portion of the approach. We're going to go down into weather that's very low and very significant. The captain should have taken control.
When it's time for the captain to say, I got the airplane because you're not performing well enough, there should be no question, no hesitation.
Why wouldn't he take over?
Investigators hear more than the effects of fatigue on the recording.
By having the first officer fly, this captain then was dividing his time being a captain and also being an instructor. We found he wasn't appropriately managing the cockpit as a captain.
Don't go 2,000 feet per minute when you're 500 feet off the ground. Bring up the altitude graph again. They're less than 500 feet off the ground. It's below their minimum descent altitude.
It's critical that you do not descend below that altitude until you have a visual view of the airport or the runway.
But they continue to descend.
Run. Oh, you can see the ground but not the runway.
They're coming down from 3,000 feet and they've got to get to the minimum descent altitude, which is only 500 feet above the ground. There's not much room to work with here if you screw this up.
Keep going.
The CDR reveals that the captain violated a fundamental rule by continuing the descent without the runway in sight.
If you don't see the field, then you do a go-around.
Because the pilots were still looking for the airport while descending below minimum altitude, neither of them noticed their decaying airspeed.
Okay, level now. Good.
They've been too slow for the last little while, and they don't recognize it with a stick shaker hanging away that they are in an aerodynamic stall. That knew them.
They weren't able to recover from the storm.
It's a perfect storm of their own making.
Investigators find enough evidence on the voice recording to conclude that fatigue was likely one component of the crew's poor decision-making.
We found that the captain's behavior could have been attributed to fatigue.
But fatigue alone doesn't explain the long list of botched procedures on Flight 1526.
They broke so many rules, makes you wonder who trained them.
They were following their procedures. They missed checklists and call-outs. They got late on the approach. They were flying in the wrong configuration. We decided to go back and take a look at their training. What was it that led up to them making these mistakes?
The NTSB orders up the employment and training records of the crew of Flight 1526 for the last 5 years.
You're not going to believe this.
They are shocked by what they find.
The captain's termination notice says that he was fired from his last job.
Investigators learned that the captain was dismissed because he failed to show up for training.
Get this. The first officer was terminated because his performance was below standard.
The first officer was let go because he struggled during flight training.
Both these guys had training issues and were fired because of them. And ExecuFlight knew about it.
The captain's prior employment was suspect in terms of why was he dismissed. The first officer's hiring in this particular case smacks of just warm body hiring, having somebody with a 98-degree temperature put in the right seat and say we've got a co-pilot because he's licensed.
So, why did ExecuFlight hire these guys?
We start to wonder, did the company know about these deficiencies? If they did they address them? Okay, thanks again. Bye. I just got off the phone with the president. He said he knew about their history, but hired them anyway. The president of ExecuFlight stated that he had hired the captain because of his extensive experience in the Hawker aircraft, as well as flights that he had personally taken with the captain prior to his employment. The first officer was hired based on a recommendation from another pilot, as well as one flight that he had taken with him personally. He said they didn't contact their previous employers.
It is very, very important in hiring a pilot to do what the law says, do what the regulations say, contact the previous employers, and have an opportunity to know if this individual has some bad habits that you certainly don't want in your operation.
ExecuFlight did give them CRM training.
Basically, cockpit resource management training is teaching pilots to work as a team and using all their available tools together so they are operating as one.
But when the investigators examined the airline's CRM training program, they are underwhelmed.
Not much of a training manual.
The regulations required ExecuFlight to have cockpit resource management training, and they did. What we found was their training was insufficient and their evaluation of the crew was not proper.
This was an accident waiting to happen.
The NTSB concludes that the probable cause of the crash was the crew's mismanagement of their approach, deviation from operating procedures, and ExecuFlight's lax hiring and training practices.
We determined that ExecuFlight did not enforce and did not make sure that the pilots were following standard operating procedures.
In their report, the NTSB makes several recommendations for private operators like ExecuFlight. They include better training for pilots on non-precision approaches like the one into Akron, and the installation of flight data recorders that could also be used to monitor the progress of their flights.
The NTSB recommendations really comes down to what kind of scrutiny you have on your pilots. Do you know what's going on in your cockpit? Do you know what your pilots are doing?
Standard operating procedures. These are incredibly important. It's like we say airspeed is life. Well, adherence to standard operating procedures is life. And if you begin to remove that structure, you go back in time and you lose the benefit of all the lessons that we have paid so dearly for in the past by crashes.